Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Marissa Waterman. I'm the Marketing Director here at the Academy. Today's webinar is the first in a series of 4. This one is titled, What are the Risks of PFAS? A Practitioner's Overview of Risk Assessment, Management, and Communication. Our Executive Director, Dr. Daniel Other, will serve as a moderator and will introduce our speaker today. During the presentation, you'll be able to submit a question by clicking on the Q&A icon on the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to address each question at the end of the presentation. Before we get started, Dr. Other would like to say a few words. Dan, how are you today?
I'm great, Marissa. Thank you. Thanks for that great introduction to today's webinar. And thanks to you, our audience, for joining us today for what is a pilot effort of something new for our Academy. As many of you are aware, the Academy has long been focused on leadership and excellence in environmental engineering and science, and our bread and butter has often been coaching folks to achieve board certification. And that remains our goal. And we've expanded our definition of our programs. The Academy strives to be the organization to link environmental engineers and scientists across diverse media, across diverse technologies, and across the career trajectory. We link water and biosolids with site remediation and human health while always considering air quality locally and globally. We link students in our ABET accredited degree programs with HR professionals through our nationwide career networking fair. We host award competitions, and for the past 2 years, we've organized an autumn summit on a broad topic to bring together a range of professionals tackling society's complex issues. Today, we launch a new pilot for our webinar program. We've linked together 4 separate webinars to study a single theme from a variety of angles. That's part of the unique value proposition of the American Academy of Environmental Engineers and Scientists. We network across media, across technologies, and across the career trajectory. Before we get into today's webinar, I want to offer some thanks to a number of folks. First and foremost, thank you to the patrons of the Academy. These utilities and firms have stepped up to provide the financial support that makes today's webinar free to members. Imagine the tremendous value that each of us experiences from webinars like today's. So if you happen to know folks in the organizations on this slide, please say thanks for their unwavering support of our profession. Second, I'd like to say thanks to the Board of Trustees, and especially Trustee at Large Anne Germain, who brainstormed the concept for this new approach to our webinar series. Thanks, Anne, for your leadership. And finally, I'd like to say thanks to the webinar committee for approving this idea and to some fantastic leaders in our Academy who stepped forward to turn this concept into a reality. We have a group of great speakers lined up over the next 4 webinars, and that's due to the hard work and fantastic networking of Narapam, Isabel, Shannon, and Olga. I'm not going to steal their thunder now. We'll be hearing from these folks during the course of the webinar series. I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you for your efforts. As Marissa and I mentioned in our introduction, today we have our first of a series of 4 webinars on the important subject of PFAS. Today, we're going to hear about fate and risk assessment. In future webinars, we'll hear about toxicology, separation and destruction, and we'll host a panel discussion to wrap up and offer over-the-horizon speculation on the future of this important subject. Today's webinar, What's the Risk of PFAS? A Practitioner's Overview of Risk Assessment, Management, and Communication is being provided by Dr. John Patali, who's with Battelle. John is a risk assessor and scientist with Battelle Memorial Institute. Prior to joining Battelle, John was a toxicologist with the state of New Hampshire, where he worked on PFAS and other emerging contaminants. He's a diplomate of the American Board of Toxicology, holds a doctorate in toxicology from the University of Nebraska Medical Center, and has a bachelor's degree in biology from Wright State University. It's truly an honor to introduce John for this first webinar. I personally love to learn from experts who are at the cutting edge of practice, and John's presentation is meant to do just that. Before we begin, as a reminder, please put your questions in the QA function, and I'll use these as part of a moderated discussion at the end of today's webinar. And now, John, the stage is yours. We are so excited to hear from you.
Great. Thank you, Dan. First, we're going to see if I can get my PowerPoint slide to advance forward. And there we go. So hi again, I'm John Patali. I'm a human health risk assessor and scientist with Battelle, and I'm here to talk about what are the risks of PFAS. And when I talk about risk here, I'm going to try to cover some of the basics of human health risk assessment because from my own experience of sometimes working with environmental engineers and other scientists, this can seem like a sort of black box part of the process of how we address environmental problems. But I also want to talk about how some of that relates to the management challenges and even risk communication challenges when dealing with PFAS, especially as we're looking at things that have happened in the last few years and moving forward in 2025 in the future with addressing these chemicals. So just a quick overview of the institution I represent. Battelle Memorial Institute is a unique nonprofit philanthropic. We do a lot of work related to PFAS, other emerging contaminants, environmental remediation cleanup, and a lot of other sectors. I've recently joined here coming from a state perspective, so I'm going to try to offer some insights both from the sort of private sector view, but also from some of my experiences working as a state regulator, dealing with PFAS both in urban and rural communities. So here's the broad agenda. So we have our obligatory agenda slide. So I'm going to first do a really basic what are PFAS, because I realize for some folks, this may be your first introduction into what PFAS, what the acronym is, what these chemicals are, and why they're an issue. I'm going to give a high-level overview of fate and transport challenges, provide some links to resources related to that. And then I'm going to talk about what's personally near and dear to me, and that is the role of risk assessment in this. And then we'll give sort of an overview of where regulatory guidance is and where it may be going. And then we'll try to wrap that up with some discussion. So to start with, what are PFAS? Because I'm going to say PFAS, PFAS, PFAS all of the time. I'm actually from Southwestern Ohio originally, and I work up in the New England area. So it's really great to see how people pronounce their vowels. Because when we talk about PFAS, we're usually referring to the family. So when you see someone saying PFAS, it's a large family of these compounds. We used to call them perfluorochemicals. The nomenclature has moved on. Each of these individual compounds has their own acronym, and it can get overwhelming pretty quickly. So for example, perfluorooctane sulfonic acid is an 8-carbon backbone, but we just call it PFOS, PFOS. Depending on your definition of PFAS, this family has over 10,000 chemicals, and that number keeps growing, again, depending on how you classify PFAS. Generally speaking, though, they have a carbon backbone structure like what you see here. Sometimes we change the acronym as we change the carbon length. So PFBS, a 4-carbon, is a short chain versus the longer chain PFOS. So as we go through this, I might say short chain, long chain to differentiate. But then we can also change functional group. So PFOS is a PFAS compound that is commonly used in a lot of stained water repellent products, also certain forms of firefighting foam. PFOA was a sort of nonstick additive that was used in sort of application development of Teflon products or other sort of oil repellent products. But then we can also have compounds that we call precursors. These are things that as they enter the environment, biotic or abiotic systems, you might have breakdown to terminal compounds. So for example, N-MeFus is something that might break down to the terminal product PFOS. And then as we get creative with not fully fluorinating, maybe adding in an ether bond somewhere, really use your imagination with any basic organic chemistry that you have, and you can come up with other novel chemistries. But really, we're talking about compounds that are heavily fluorinated to some degree, depending on your definition, and they typically have an alkyl chain. Now, what makes these unique? Well, the first thing is that carbon-fluorine bond. So the sort of stick letter models that we use don't really paint the picture, so I try to have a couple different versions of how you might think about these. But that carbon-fluorine bond is really strong, and it makes PFAS products or PFAS chemicals extremely resistant to degradation, both in industrial processes, but also in the environment. Now, this can be very desirable. So for example, if you're working in the energy sector, if you're working on batteries, if you're wanting products that are stain and water repellent for a long time, this is really desirable. And that's because that carbon-fluorine bond is incredibly strong. But also when we apply it to these long alkyl chains, if you look at that bottom picture with it looks like a really swollen caterpillar. You basically get this effect where the fluorines create a shielding effect around the backbone, and that protects that structure, that function that you have from these compounds. Now, a lot of these can behave as surfactants. So a lot of us, when we're taught about organic contaminants in the environment or non-organic contaminants, we think Is this water loving? Is this water fearing? So hydrophilic, hydrophobic, that kind of lets us predict where we're going to see it in the environment, right? Is this a challenge for sediments and we don't have to worry about surface water? Is this a problem for drinking water and we don't have to worry about soil? But PFAS are unique in that they actually have both of these properties. And because of the different functional groups they might have, it even further complicates their environmental behaviors and what they might do that affects their mobility, where they'll reside. But because they confer stain, water, and oil repellency, we've used them in a lot of commercial products and also in a lot of commercial processes. So, very busy slide here, partially intended to be busy because this is how it can feel if you're trying to figure out where PFAS are in consumer products. It's also where a lot of us can be if, for example, you are working for a manufacturing company and you're trying to understand, are you using PFAS in some production process? So we have things like electronics and batteries, especially with the electric vehicle and sort of green energy transition. There's been a lot of use of PFAS in those products. Chemical production, manufacturing aid, medical devices, laboratory equipment. For anyone that wants to know sort of those examples of lab equipment, go find your local chemist and ask them how many pieces of tubing or equipment can cause cross-contamination for PFAS in samples. But I will say the largest use of this, the most significant one that's gotten a lot of attention, has been the use of aqueous film forming foams. And these are sometimes called Class B firefighting foams. And these have been used for several decades, especially on military installations, to manage and control oil-based or fuel-based fires. So the idea is you take concentrate PFAS, you mix it with water. Remember, it acts like a surfactant, so it'll foam, and it'll basically separate fuel from oxygen very quickly. So that's great if you're trying to put out, for example, a plane that's coming in, it's on fire, and it's about to land on an aircraft carrier, and you're worried about protecting life and reducing damage. But when this is something that will still then just spill into the environment, it won't break down for hundreds of thousands of years, you now have a source of contamination. So this has been a huge issue around the country, also around the world at sites that have used this. Even from an example of, I live up here in New Hampshire, and we did a lot of work focusing on one military base that we had with firefighting foam. And then we realized, oh, we have a lot of communities that are still on oil heat. So a lot of local fire departments actually use this type of foam. And some of them don't realize that they're using it. They don't realize that it has a risk of contamination. And some of them are only beginning to learn about that. So a lot of communities are beginning to grapple with this presence of AFFF contamination. There's a lot of textile and coatings, cosmetic, personal care products. Really, if you just Google PFAS in, you're going to get some news article this week of PFAS was found in another product that people were testing for. So this isn't an all-encompassing slide, but it's to give you a sense of there's a lot of applications about this. And if you start thinking about, you might actually be using either PFAS in a manufacturing process that you're working with, if you're sort of on that upstream end of things, or if you're working on contaminated sites, if you look at the history of some of your sites, you might find that there was something else there that contributed to some PFAS contamination. Now, this is a great diagram from paper back in 2019. I love referencing it, except I always like to modify it with one additional arrow. So I'm sure Elsie Sunderland has a bone to pick with me about that. But generally, PFAS are entirely man-made. There's no real actual natural source of these compounds. So they're generally getting to the environment either through industrial releases, the consumer products that are out there on the market that end up in our waste infrastructure, or things like firefighting foam. So eventually these work their way into the environment. There's potential for human exposure. And generally speaking, almost everyone that has their blood tested for PFAS has some detectable level of PFAS in them. Now, we call these forever chemicals a lot of times in the media. They do stick around in our body for a while, but they are gradually released in urine, primarily feces. And this is something that actually ends up back in our waste infrastructure. So when we talk about the problem of PFAS, I find it really useful to think about this as, are you focusing on sort of the upstream manufacturing and product side when you're talking about this as environmental engineers or scientists, right? Are you helping a company think about what their alternatives are? Or are you dealing with existing environmental occurrence, right? Horses left the barn, there's cats everywhere, it's a mess at your site. What are you dealing with? Now, because of their persistence and because of their chemical properties, they're quite mobile, so they don't really break down. They just kind of move around. And depending on their structure, their chemistry, Some can move farther than others. Typically, short chains seem to move further and easier in water than long chains do. You have more adherence of long chain compounds, things like sediment and soils. Some of the fluorotelomere alcohols, so these are compounds with sort of ether groups or other functional groups, seem to be potentially volatile. They could be released in air emissions. And actually, depending on their structure and chemistry, some of them have preferential bioaccumulation uptake into plants, animals, wildlife, agricultural products. The list keeps growing. And this is why this is getting so much attention in the environmental science realm. Is it's not just a drinking water problem. It's not just a soil problem. It's not just a biosolids problem. It's everywhere, all at once. Now, this is a great slide from the state of Michigan, so I'd like to give them credit. They do a lot of amazing work up there with their MPART group, but you can start thinking more specifically on, depending on what kind of site you're working with, what kind of industry you're working with, what media might be releasing PFAS into the environment. And oftentimes, these are the sort of models, sort of fate and transport ideas that we're using to figure out where do we want to start looking at risk? Where do we want to start thinking about regulations? Where can we look at reduction into the environment? So a lot of states have done this kind of work. This is something that in the early parts of, I'd say, the like 2014 range, when this is starting to be discovered in a lot of drinking water systems, to about the 2020 timeframe, there wasn't much action on the federal level by EPA looking at actually setting regulations or doing the studies. It was just getting going. A lot of states stepped in and filled in that gap. Michigan is one of those. New Hampshire is another one. I'd like to give them a shout out. But a lot of other states have done some really amazing work and have great staff that are working on this, that are always eager to talk to people to try to understand this problem. Now, what's the role of risk assessment? Why am I here as a risk assessor, besides to just terrify people by talking nebulously about risk? And if you've ever talked to a risk assessor on a project, you notice we can never say yes or no to a question. The idea with risk assessment is we're helping you to prioritize where, if you have limited resources, are you going to make the most impact to protect health? In an ideal world, we have no contamination, we don't have to deal with it, there's no risk. However, in the case of PFAS, like other organic contaminants and persistent pollutants, they are present in the environment. They are present in our products. Everyone has some level of exposure. In communities with significant drinking water contamination or contamination to food sources, there's even more exposure than what we see in the rest of the population. And again, this is something that the tools of risk assessment can come in to help you try to figure out what's the best media to sample, instead of you just going out and randomly sampling everything, getting mismatched data that you're going to have to go back out and collect more samples for. Right? Talk with your risk assessors to understand, okay, for this group of chemicals, for these contaminants, for your analyte list that's available, what's the best place to start sampling if you're trying to reduce human health risk and use limited resources at an investigation to have the most impact? But we also play a role in thinking about risk management and communication. So with risk management, maybe that's looking more upstream, that's trying to understand what policies are in place to let the contamination get in there. Again, where could you have the most impact if you acted? But it's also an important role for risk communicators to get out and talk with stakeholders and the public about what these health risks are. And a lot of times we'll focus very heavily on trying to talk to the public, so generally community members, about what the risks are, what those impacts were. But you can also think of this on the side of actually talking more upstream with industry users, manufacturers, to understand, hey, what's the risk and liability here? And what could you be doing to find safer alternatives? And then finally, there's that ability to use risk assessment to actually evaluate the effectiveness of your remedial actions and strategies. Are your destruction technologies getting us low enough that it's making a difference to people's risk and exposure? So with PFAS, we do know that there are health risks. There is basically this sort of consensus right now that chronic exposure is associated with a lot of changes in clinical markers, certain increased risk of various health outcomes. The Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, which is within the CDC, produced this great, very in-depth report sort of summarizing a lot of those studies, what the impacts are, a lot of the toxicology. More recently, there was guidance that was put out by the National Academy of Science and Engineering Medicine, really focused on enhancing that report and that information so that way providers could talk to people about what certain exposure levels might mean or what they should be thinking about for people's health outcomes. As a toxicologist by training, I could suck the oxygen out of the room right now for the next 3 hours talking about the toxicology, but apparently in January, you have another webinar in this series that they are going to talk about toxicology. So I would highly recommend that if you're interested, you sign up for that or take my email address at the end of this. I love having coffee and talking with people about biological processes and what's being thrown out of whack. Now, one of the things that gets some people wrapped around the wheel with PFAS is usually we're talking about really low environmental levels for regulation. So parts per trillion in water, parts per billion or trillion in food and soil levels. And a lot of people ask, why is that? What makes these compounds so toxic? Well, part of it is certain blood levels are associated with adverse health outcomes. But one of the things that really drives the PFAS numbers low is actually just how bioaccumulative certain PFAS are. So long-chain PFAS like PFOA and PFOS, so that 8 carbon, usually longer, sometimes around 6 to 8 carbons, tend to have very long half-lives in our body. So that's the amount of time that if we could magically stop your exposure, we would see your concentrations, your blood levels go down by half. For a compound like PFOA, that's about 2 to 4 years. And in toxicology terms, we usually imagine 5 half-lives out is an eliminated exposure. So 15 to 20 years if you could stop your PFOA exposure to actually get it pretty close to zero. Now, with other compounds, that's longer. Some PFAS have been estimated up into 10 years, but you also have short chain compounds like PFBA, the 4-carbon sort of sibling of PFOA, that its half-life is on a matter of hours to days. So this makes PFAS really tricky for estimating the safe levels because we're really working with internal doses, and then we're using toxicokinetic modeling to extrapolate that to an oral dose or an amount per unit of body weight per unit of time, so nanograms or milligrams of chemical for every kilogram of your body weight per day, that is without risk. So recently, the US EPA estimated that value in milligrams per kilogram per day, that's equivalent to 0.03 nanograms per kilogram per day is the dose without appreciable risk from PFOA. PFBA is much higher, and a lot of that stems from PFBA is not as bioaccumulative, and we have less information on that one than we do PFOA. Now, we call these doses reference doses. We have a different unit of measure for looking at cancer risk, but to save time, I'm not going to get too deep into that one. But essentially, this is what we're doing as risk assessors, is we're using toxicological information. We're trying to understand what is that dose that we're worried about, and then we're using really fun math to extrapolate that to environmental concentrations that we're helping you as site managers, engineers, and other scientists to make decisions off of. So a lot of times risk assessments providing these benchmarks. So we usually start with what's called a screening level. So that's not you're an absolute danger. That is think of almost like a traffic light. It's a yellow, like you should start pumping the brakes. We should see what's going on. Let's investigate some more. So if we use the current dose that the US EPA has set, and we assume an 80 kilogram adult is drinking 2 liters per day, we want to put in a margin of safety. So basically a factor of 10 or multiply by 0.1. Right, we're at a pretty small number, so about 0.12 parts per trillion or nanograms per liter. Now, screening levels are different than regulatory limits, and that's usually a thing that a lot of engineers are working with at sites is what is the cleanup number? What is the action number? What is you exceeded this, your public water system needs to put on treatment. In this case, maximum contaminant levels are what we use in public water systems. So again, example with drinking water, but that number is 4. And these regulatory limits are usually required not only to consider risk, so that dose that I talked about, but we also think about things like feasibility to treat and even detect down to those levels, as well as the overall cost of monitoring and management. So the US EPA number is 4, but that's actually because they think that 2 was the reliable lab limit at the time when they set it, and 4 is double 2. So if you can measure a 4, you're confident it's a 4, whereas they weren't as confident a 2 was a 2. Similarly for PFOS, that's how they came to that number. Ideally, the goal is 0 for both PFOA and PFOS because the EPA considers them to be carcinogens now. So there's screening levels, there's regulatory limits, but sometimes you're working in more case-specific scenarios. Maybe you're working at an isolated agricultural site. Maybe you're working at tribal fishing grounds where you're not trying to set a limit for everyone in the United States. You actually have more tailored information about what's going on there, and you want that to be considered. And that's one of the other things that risk assessors can support you with on your projects. And we do this with every other chemical. PFAS is just another one in the list that we look at sites. I want to give an example of some work that we've been doing up here in New Hampshire. I've been doing this with colleagues up at Dartmouth College, who, if you'd love to hear talk about how much of a nightmare it is to work in an estuary system with organic contaminants, work around multiple sources, and also building off of work that people did with mercury and leveraging existing knowledge, I'm happy to give you their information. So here's an example where we look at site-specific risk assessment for recreational shellfish harvesters. In New Hampshire, we have a lot of people that'll go out, they'll collect their own shellfish to eat. There's various sites that they go to. There's no real regulations right now for PFAS and shellfish from the FDA or other regulatory agencies. So we try to come up with a conceptual site model. So here's a fun picture of me digging around in the mud, trying to find clams. But we ask ourselves, okay, if people are eating this at a certain rate, if they're going out and harvesting at a certain frequency, if they're coming in contact with the sediment, and maybe if they're not washing their hands very well, how much incidental sediment are they ingesting? If we look at the concentrations of PFAS in those shellfish, if we look at the concentrations inside the water and sediment, what happens there? So previous slide, I showed you a pretty straightforward equation of number times number divided by number. For risk assessment, we get more complicated. And this is not anything that anyone's going to be quizzed on, but it's this idea of risk assessors and toxicologists can sort of bring this value add when you're looking at these sites to understanding, okay, what's the frequency? How often are these shellfish beds open, right? Because part of our job, we need to go in, look, what are the local harvesting habits? What seasons of the year are these available? What's the frequency that people catch these? A lot of these other factors that we want to think about. And even if we can get more chemical specific data, right? How well does PFAS penetrate the skin? Because as a surfactant, it doesn't probably penetrate the skin as well as things like PCBs or oil products. But at the same time, it's not like it's metals or some other charged species that are not going to penetrate the skin. And that's still an evolving area of research. So we can try to look at these multiple routes of exposure and we can come up with quotients for risk. So the idea is if you look at the graphs over here, these are different groups. We have our typical 50th percentile consumers, and then we have our high-end consumers, people that really love like Cioppino or steamed clams or really making a big dish. And we can look at what are the contributions to risk. And we use these things called hazard quotients. And it's basically to say if your hazard quotient goes above 1, you have a problem. And looking at this with PFOS, we see that for the most part with PFOS, we don't really have too many problems. We might be concerned about children who are high-end consumers, but it really lets us prioritize where are we going to focus public health efforts. So it's really looking at these gray bars, we're seeing consumption is the driver of risk, not dermal contact or incidental ingestion. So we're really going to focus on how are we communicating to this public so they can make decisions about where to harvest at. But also lets us know we really want to focus more in on what processes are driving bioaccumulation into these shellfish. So that is one of the value-added things that we can sort of do with this. But one of the challenges with PFAS is these often occur as mixtures. And if we start stacking these together, we start seeing that there is potential for excess or elevated risk with exposure to these compounds. So now we're going to shift gears just a little bit to talk about some of the regulatory activities that have been going on. At the federal level, the big news that everyone's paying attention to this last year was the announcement of PFAS maximum contaminant levels for 6 of them. These are enforceable numbers, and that's part of the reason they gain so much attention is this applies to public water systems. Many of your communities, if you go talk to your public water entities, they've probably started monitoring or looking into what that process is going to be. Again, MCLs consider the health risks, but they also have to weigh cost and benefit. And these are actually currently facing some legal challenge in court. It's not too surprising, but this may affect the long-term fate of these rules as they move forward. There's also been a CERCLA designation for PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances. So in the slide deck that'll be shared after this, the link should be live to those appropriate documents. This has raised a lot of questions, concerns, and actually to certain points some urban legends about what this is going to mean for potential litigation and liability. A lot of this will come down to discretion of the EPA administrator, but there are some questions and concerns about what does this mean for communities or municipal entities potentially facing lawsuits around hazardous substance designation and the release of these. And then there's also been recently some ambient water quality criteria, which are set for surface water, because surface water is regulated differently than drinking water. So there's some guidance for about 10 PFAS out of that. These are typically higher than what we see with the drinking water numbers, because these are more meant for a different exposure scenario, but some of these are more geared towards wildlife protection and ecological risks. Now, that's been a lot of the US EPA action sort of on addressing contamination in the environment, but it'd be remiss to point out that 11 states prior to or up to 2024 had set their own drinking water MCLs. These numbers vary differently depending on which state you're in. They've taken different approaches to risk assessment using what was the latest science at the time that they set those. So there's been some disparity between the exact numbers of those, but a lot of these states tried to move forward in the absence of that EPA leadership. And they've set their own MCL. So some states have already been monitoring for or treating for these compounds. The MCLs that came out from EPA just sort of reinforced those and said, hey, continue to monitor with the data that you have. Some states also set non-enforceable drinking water guidance. So they cannot compel a public water system to meet that number, but they do have to require notification to let community members know that water is exceeding that and it's beyond that contamination. Some states are using their own hazardous substance designations under their own waste rules to actually look into this. And that's something that, depending on where you manage sites or if you're doing investigations, it's worth checking. Is your state considering a promulgation of such a rule? But then the more broader challenge is also PFAS are not just a drinking water contaminant. We know that they're in soils, they're in groundwater, surface water, fish, wildlife, agricultural products. Essentially, if you start testing for PFAS, you're probably going to find it somewhere. So in the absence of regulations for that, a lot of folks are either turning to risk assessment or other methods to have some sort of decision-making tool. Now, to give a sense of what the drinking water limits are and why there could be some confusion. So here in the first column are the MCLs, or enforceable numbers by the EPA for PFOA, PFOS, and then 4 other PFAS. So that's PFHXS, so it's a 6-carbon sulfonic acid, PFNA, a 9-carbon carboxylic acid, and then PFBS, a 4-carbon sulfonic acid, and GenX, which is a sort of different compound. I'm not sure why they named it GenX. I don't think anyone watched Captain Planet in the 90s when they came up with that. That's not a great name for something, especially with risk communication. But you have the individual numbers in parts per trillion there. The reason that those are grayed is for those 4 compounds, the EPA is actually proposing what's called a hazard index to combine the concentrations of those and come up with a sort of regulatory limit based off of that. Historically, they have not used that for MCLs or enforceable limits. It's usually used for site investigations. And that's been one thing that's raised some questions about this is a novel tool to deal with a novel class of chemicals. And how are they going to move forward with that? Now, the middle column is actually the US EPA regional screening levels. And these are numbers that might be used at various sites to actually screen for PFAS and determine, is there risk that requires more investigation? Should people be looking at it more? You can see those numbers are then very different than the MCLs. I would make note that for PFHXS, PFNA, EPA has draft changes to their toxicity numbers. If those move forward, you can probably move the decimal places over on those 2 compounds, and it'll look more similar to what you see with PFOS, PFOA. But then even within the federal government, there is some sort of disagreement where if we then look at like the Department of Defense, they recently put out a memo for a lot of their PFAS contaminated sites of what numbers are they using for screening to target remediation, cleanup, and providing alternative water, which again, these are somewhat different. So for all of us in the regulatory realm, we kind of walk through to say, oh, okay, you're using different numbers for different applications, there are different rulemaking authorities. this can be extremely confusing to the general public. This can be very confusing and understandably upsetting to community members who have contaminated water, and they're seeing that different agencies are telling them different levels of what is quote unquote safe. So this has created a lot of challenges. It'll probably continue to be a challenge moving forward, especially if the US EPA MCLs remain in court, they're not applied, and we go back to what we had for a few years of different states with different numbers. And especially up here in New England, we see this quite often as we're a small enough region, everyone can point to their neighbor and say, hey, they're doing this, why aren't we? Now, getting ahead of this, right? So I mentioned before, talking about source reduction alternative assessments, the US EPA has a strategic roadmap where they've outlined a lot of the activities that have been nationally focused on this issue. The Department of Defense has been working on finding an alternative to AFFF, that fluorine-containing foam. They were required to have a complete phase-out this year. There's a report for the Government Accountability Office that highlights they do have sort of permission that if they need an extension to 2026, they can, because there is the issue of how much alternative is available. Does it meet the military specifications for safety? And again, swapping all that out, it's not just swapping out barrels at the firefighting house that the trucks use. There are hangars that contain AFFF systems that have to be swapped out. How do you swap those out and deal with that waste? There are other systems that even in chemical manufacturing, chemical control, especially like oil fuel production, that they're also having the same challenge of everyone's trying to transition. We're basically back to that terrible phrase of what's the supply chain issue. Under the Toxic Substance Control Act, you can read more about this in the roadmap details, but there's now going to be a reporting requirement for a specific definition of PFAS, so that way the EPA and the government can have a better understanding of where PFAS are being used in commerce and in industry. So I would expect that that's going to keep moving forward, but I also expect a lot of folks are going to find some valuable information digging through there to identify other potential sources of PFAS in the environment and also into waste streams. And what's near and dear to me, because I'm in one of those states that has a product ban, is there's been a lot of states that have actually moved forward with consumer product bans for PFAS. So some of these have exemptions for various products. So for example, electric vehicles seem to be getting a pass on several of these because they have a lot of PFAS components in there. But a lot of these states have moved forward with this simply to get PFAS out of the waste stream so it's not a burden both on the municipal waste systems, municipal wastewater systems, but also for, again, that exposure reduction, protection of health. Now, for a lot of these, especially with the reporting requirement, this has been really tricky. And a lot of these bans have been sort of getting kicked out. They've been getting extensions to their active dates because for a manufacturer, it's really hard to know if PFAS is in your product, right? It's hard to contact your supplier, especially if it's an overseas supplier, and you ask them, is there any PFAS in this? If their country doesn't have any reporting requirements for that, they may not know, you will not know. So you're just going to put a question mark on any of the paperwork that you're supposed to submit for these bans. Some companies have been struggling to figure out what an alternative would be. And if they can't find an alternative, is that doom for the company? Do they just not offer that product anymore? Right? There's these sort of logistical and feasibility questions that folks are running into. What's also been really challenging with this reporting piece is something that's challenging for a lot of the regulations and a lot of the management of PFAS, both upstream and downstream, of what is a PFAS? Right? I showed you a slide earlier where I said, yeah, it's a squiggly line with a bunch of F's around it. That's a PFAS. But what's the actual chemical definition? I said it's a family of over 10,000. Those definitions vary based on agency and who you're talking to. So in the National Defense Authorization Act, that's one fully fluorinated carbon atom is considered a PFAS. And a lot of states have adopted that for their product bans. For those of you that do work with pharmaceuticals, with pesticides, with coatings, with a lot of other materials, you can probably think of some things that, you know, if you had your chemist in the room and you looked at those earlier examples that I said were PFAS, they might argue that a single fluorinated carbon doesn't meet that. There was a great paper that came out back in 2020 where they tried to be more clear about that and accounting for the issue that some PFAS exist as like polymers. So a lot of plastic products, arguably if they broke down to their monomer components, are those PFAS? Are they PFAS as the polymer? If so, do we ban things like Teflon, a lot of medical tubing devices? What do we do with that? A different definition was developed by the OECD, so the group that does a lot of sort of international work, as well as with the European Union. But we also see that there's also been definitions kicked around by sort of NGOs and some community advocacy groups of if there's one fluorine atom in an organic substance, it's a PFAS. And right, that gets to be really challenging, especially from pharmaceutical industry, production industries, a lot of other groups of there's utility to that organic fluorine chemistry. Is it really worth banning all of it because a single fluorine atom makes it a PFAS? Now, to even complicate that further is the US EPA within itself as a federal agency has been using different definitions of what is a PFAS. So the TSCA reporting rule has a different definition than Office of Pollution Prevention Toxics. Drinking water monitoring rule is something different. And again, if you compare those back to the National Defense Authorization Act, which was determined by Congress, not a bunch of scientists, right? They're very different definitions of what would fall in there. And depending on who is reviewing what, you might find that TSCA isn't meeting what National Defense Authorization Act used to define as PFAS. So they have things that are slipping through. But at the same time, for TSCA, they're trying to be more specific and focused on what's being used in industries and what they truly consider to be PFAS. The point of this is it's getting challenging, and that's where there will continue to be these issues of what defines a PFAS. I would not be surprised if as reporting comes in, you have people pointing out there's inconsistencies and things are falling through the cracks, but it is a question of how do we want to address something that's so complicated as this class of chemicals. Now, unfortunately, this got pushed to the end. I'm always sad that it gets pushed to the end. And knowing that you all do webinar series, I hope that you invite a bunch of people to come in and do risk communication series. But risk communication is more important than ever, especially for PFAS. But I think, sort of reading the room and everyone appreciating sort of this last election, a lot of things have been going on in the last couple of years. There is mistrust of public health institutions and by extension, environmental health institutions. And we need to be mindful of that. But PFAS have very unique characteristics that make them an environmental problem because they're persistent, they're bioaccumulative, they can be toxic, but they also can be very challenging for risk communication because they elicit a lot of strong feelings and responses, right? They're man-made, there's constantly changing information, there's a lack of control. And that can put a lot of people, not only the public, but also us as technical experts, in a bad headspace for thinking about how to deal with things. And we should be conscious of that when we're dealing with a challenge like this. I've done a lot of work with communities up here in New Hampshire, and you will be amazed how much you can learn from working with those communities, engaging with them early on, no decisions about them without them. But also a lot of other groups have focused on risk communication tools. So I have links in here. ITRC Risk Communication Toolkit is a great place to start if you are trying to work on sites, work with communities, and sort of want some templates or ideas of how you can approach that. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has knocked it out of the park with PFAS. They have a lot of great examples, information, content on there. US EPA has a webpage. I'm going to follow the rule. If you can't say nothing nice, don't say anything at all. But it is an interesting contrast from sort of the perspective of actually working with communities. And again, the MPARC group from Michigan, they have some great resources, including some really neat videos online for, if you're trying to do sort of social media outreach, I would definitely recommend linking to them. There's a lot of other groups, but you need to figure out what works for you. So the picture over here, the top one was back in 2018, where we were doing the sort of standard, going out, putting people in painful plastic chairs late at night, when they had to find a sitter, and they would come in and talk about their town's water being contaminated. Things would get hostile fast, understandably. But then as we move forward, we started figuring out, hey, people want to be able to have discussions with experts. We realized, oh, we can actually do these sort of webinar formats that people are happy to call in for. And as long as we stay on the webinar until they're done asking questions, it really helps diffuse things so people understand all the work that we're doing, what we know, what we don't know, and being transparent about that. And again, I'm always happy to talk with folks about risk communication ideas or projects you might be working on, because again, if you don't have buy-in from your communities, a lot of your solutions are not going to be accepted. You're not going to be able to move forward, and we're all just going to be spinning our wheels with this mess. So if I had to look into my crystal ball and see where things are going, I would say that PFAS is going to continue to be challenging for us, not just from a technical perspective of management, cleanup, remediation, but I think it's also hopeful. And that's because there's been a huge amount of collaboration in this space. I have never in my career been to conferences really where there is so much collaboration, information sharing as what we see with PFAS. So people are not hoarding information. No one's sitting on stuff because they don't really want to, they're not worried about getting scooped. It's really this understanding of, hey, we're all learning about this together. And that transparency and that honesty really moves the conversations forward in the technical realm. But it's also really helpful for people to sort of still have trust in science, our process, all of our work when they say, hey, we're struggling with this and we're being honest and transparent about the things we don't know. I do expect the management strategies will change. Part of that will be however the political winds blow, but it's also going to change based on as we refine our understanding of the health risk, how and when people are being exposed, and what technologies are actually available to deal with these contaminants in different media. And most importantly, a lot of the basic research that's being done both by federal agencies, local state agencies, in the private sector, and at academic institutions is helping us to close these crucial data gaps that we need to answer a lot of these questions. So I work with a really great team at Battelle. I'm just the toxicology nerd that'll prattle on about risk assessment, toxicology, fish, risk communication. We also have a lot of great experts that are always interested in looking for collaborations, partnerships, figuring out how we can move the ball forward on this challenge. Shalene Thomas does a lot of work with PFAS and products. Kavitha Dasu does some really neat non-target analysis, things like fingerprinting. And then Dan is always doing the dog and pony show on the road about some of the technology that we've worked with another company to commercialize, actually looking at AFFF destruction, that some states are actually sending bulk AFFF to now for actual destruction and not having to store it or put it in a landfill. So there's my contact information. There are also some great resources there. So again, the US EPA website, ITRC, the Interstate Technology Regulatory Council, has an amazing PFAS document that is just constantly reviewed. If you're looking for a primer, if you're looking for a great thing that students can kind of digest, if you want to make class assignments out of it, I highly recommend the ITRC document. There's also CertUp ETSCP, which is a part of the DoD that's doing a lot of work on PFAS and ecotoxicology, fate and transport, destruction technology. They have a lot of great free webinars. They have a lot of great free resources online. And then finally, there's information for the Battelle website that is just basically the only thing I could find on our website of, hey, here's what we do with PFAS, so if you're interested. And with that, I will open it up for questions and discussion.
Hey, John, that was awesome. I'll ask you, maybe we'll stop sharing the slide, and then that way people will be able to see our smiling faces. We can have our little bit of our moderated discussion. Oh, that was, my friend, that was amazing. That was exactly what we were looking for. It was incredibly inviting. It was incredibly accessible. We've got a bunch of questions that have come in. I'm going to go through and kind of pull those together, kind of put them in some categories, and we'll have a little bit of a moderated discussion, right? So some of the stuff that's coming in, folks are asking a question about like, hey, can I get your slides? When can I see this on YouTube? So just so that everybody knows, John's already provided his slides. We've got a PDF of that. We'll be posting that on the website. So the slides will be available. And we'll also have this on YouTube. Now, just so everybody's on the same page, we post that a couple of weeks after the live so that there's an incentive to attend the live. So the recorded will be up, but we usually put it up a couple of weeks later. So just so folks are on the same page. Now, John, some of the questions we've got.
Sure.
Some background questions, right? So, if Battelle and others were looking at this in the mid-90s, and then we don't even start getting serious about it until 2014, and then we move forward now, like, shouldn't we have pumped the brakes on sooner? And how do we measure deal with other things, kind of what are some lessons learned when we're thinking about this? And how do we not look ignorant when we're trying to talk about this whole like class of compounds? You know, you alluded to the different way to pronounce them. You talked about some of the different chemistry, but you know, it seems like short of getting a PhD in toxicology or chemistry, how are we going to work in some of this space? So that's a little bit some of the background issue.
Mhm.
Then there was
Yeah,
a
so
little,
I'll start.
well, you know,
Oh,
maybe I'll go through and kind of run through what we'll talk about, and
okay.
then we'll come back
Sure.
with.
Sure.
So
Sure.
then there were some questions that I would characterize in kind of understanding the problem, right? So you talked about one of the goals of risk assessment is to prioritize when faced with limited resources. So it kind of naturally begs the question, is PFAS just a first world problem, right? Like the whole rest of the world, everybody's dealing with all kinds of stuff, and we seem to be, you know, obsessed on nanogram level of materials and a family of compounds that have millions. So you know, let's kind of understand that. You talked about carcinogenicity, so there was a particular question people ask, you know, some of these are a little bit more detailed. Is it a potential carcinogen, suspected carcinogen, proven carcinogen? We'll get back to that. You mentioned about a release from human body over time. So folks were interested in that. Again, we'll come back. A little bit more general, though, the idea of toxicology as opposed to epidemiology. You know, we think about the toxicology a little bit, maybe more the basic-y science kind of stuff, epidemiology, a little bit more the applied side. So is there a benefit or trade-off between relying a little bit on more or a little bit on the other, and the difference between what the EPA is promoting versus maybe what some other countries are promoting? The link between risk assessment and legal liability and the legal challenges of the MCL. So those are, you know, those are some of the understanding the problem questions. It was interesting as an engineer. You talked about 5 half-lives for clearance. We often think about 3 half-lives or 3 residence time to clear something from a tank when we're talking about a reactor. So you've already got 2 extra residence times in there, and then you had a multiplication of a factor of 10 for safety factor. So just interesting to understand particulars of how those are in the toxicology field. So we'll come back to some of that. And then we had some specific questions, right? You know, does the EPA have a limit for PFOS, PFOS? And how would that matter for water treatment? What are some technologies that might help get rid of this? Like, does activated carbon work? Do you see PFAS being in the NPDES permits for the Clean Water Act? Some of those may be outside of your immediate expertise and might be part of additional webinars. So we'll come back to those individually, and maybe between the two of us, we'll see how we either answer those here or defer to other webinars. Some great questions came in about risk communication. You know, if somebody's willing to eat raw shellfish, you know, and they got to drive there and be out there in those tidal pools, is that really, you know, the kind of person that's worried about risk, right? So how do we put all that to, you know, the rubber meets the road, the practical things. And, you know, we're dealing with the obesity epidemic here in America. If we got this kind of eat this, not that approach, nutrition hasn't seemed to work, exercise, do we really think that's going to be kind of the approach that works here? If these things are everywhere, including in our body, is there really a way to clean it up? Or is this really one of those precautionary, let's deal with future problems and then start to treat them where we can? But does it really make sense to say, let's go out and clean them up in the environment? Or should this maybe be a hot spots kind of thing?
Mhm.
And then, you know, finally, a question that we regularly ask folks, you want to get involved in this, you know, early career, emerging career, second career folks, little bit of how they would get into an organization like Battelle, kind of a little bit of, you know, how you got to where you are. What would be your advice to others that would see themselves in a role you're in? So how would they get there? So we'll kind of wrap with that. So that's kind of the breadth of what we'll be talking about in the discussion. So maybe we'll go back to some of those background. You know, okay, so we're only looking at this now, but we've been making these for a while. And there was even some literature that suggested maybe in the 90s, maybe even Battelle and others had done some work there. You know, the practical question, why did we wait? And what would we do differently for other or next threats so that maybe we don't wait as long as we're looking at the next thing that's on the horizon of, wow, boy, if we hadn't released this in the first place, maybe it wouldn't be a problem. How do you address that?
So I think there's even a broader theme to that. So for everyone that's been at this game for a while, this has been the story we keep running into with emerging contaminants, is as our analytical capabilities sort of get lower and lower on what we can detect, and as we gradually start getting more and more research out there that starts getting our attention saying that there is a risk, we start to become responsive to it. And then it kind of builds on itself of, right, as you go into the early 2000s, we start seeing more and more publications of, hey, this thing is present, this is present, this is present. Why aren't we doing anything about this? And then it starts directing where research funding goes. And I will say, from someone that used to work on pesticides and from working with a lot of academic groups up here in the region that have worked on heavy metals, PCBs, other contaminants, we do kind of go through these phases of, as a new emerging contaminant comes around, it seems to sort of divert funding from research and focus on all the other legacy things that still haven't gone away and we're still dealing with. But I think PFAS, a lot of it has, I think one of the biggest drivers around it has been the risk perception piece. So, right, risk perception is a sort of, we can almost do like a 2x2 grid, if anyone's familiar with Peter Salmon risk communication, of, is this actually hazardous or do people just think it's hazardous? And also, do they care or are they outraged? And with PFAS, right, I said it has a lot of these features that really drives outrage. It drives a strong risk perception response. So that's where we've had a lot of direction by federal agencies, by legislatures at the state and federal level, really starting to put resources into this. But there is this sort of ubiquity of everyone having some exposure, and the health literature has really evolved where we do see a lot of associations that are concerning because of a lot of different things that PFAS seem to be able to affect. But that also raises a lot of questions because we don't have too many chemicals that seem to hit just about every system in the body. And there's some legitimate points of debate around the toxicology of PFAS. I don't want to steal the thunder of your speaker in January, but again, that's where, this is controversial. There's uncertainty that's driving a lot of focus on it. But also, as people are sort of picking up and finding it in their system or in their sort of drinking water systems, these other places, and we realize that there is a high potential for exposure, set aside health risk, but there's just that high potential for exposure, people just aren't comfortable with that. So a lot of this has been driven sort of, again, by, you have these sort of groups and either community groups, you have legislatures, you have these other ones that are saying this is a priority. They want this looked at. And I think, especially in more recent years, that has driven a fair amount of it. I do think that there's definitely risk to PFAS. There's definitely concerns at low levels of these. I think getting from the later questions, there are debates about how exactly we estimate those numbers and how low is low. I think that's a fair thing for people to discuss and debate about, but it does raise enough concern, enough questions that you can understand where states have been passing laws and then the federal government eventually had to step in. But we're also seeing this in other countries where the numbers are coming lower and lower as more information is coming out. Australia, that previously used to be in the hundreds of parts per trillion, borderline parts per billion units for their guidance, they recently announced that they're looking at going down to 4 parts per trillion, where the US EPA has gone. And they have much larger contaminated sites out in Australia. They really went crazy with the foam out there. So they have some really unique challenges that they're dealing with as well. But again, they're not shying away from it just because there's this issue. They're looking at, hey, this is what the health information is telling us. But there still needs to be that discussion about what's the feasibility.
I mean, that's very practical, right? Because it's like no one wants to leave humanity with a problem that harms humans or the planet, right? No one wants that. Now, then the question is, how do we move forward with that? And I think that's part of this in the understanding the problem. There's these kind of classic memes that float around, like the first world problems, right? What do I watch on my streaming service tonight or something like that, right? So how do we understand the realness for PFAS, right? We've got this idea of a world of limited resource. We're trying to take care of things like, climate change. We're trying to take care of things like environmental justice. We're trying to take care of things like PFAS. And it seems like every single thing gets presented as, well, this is it. This is the burning dumpster fire and all hands on deck, all resources. And you're kind of thinking, well, how many of those can we have simultaneously to deal with? So, how do we understand PFAS in that constellation? Everything seems to be an emerging problem right now. So
Well, and it's that you're asking people to walk and chew gum, which I think we can do at the same time. If everyone just takes a breath and doesn't get overwhelmed by thinking, why is it hard to walk and chew gum? We can do it. But it is that piece where I think in the same way in sort of research circles, we can be very isolated in what we're focused on. You can also see that sometimes in legislative circles and policymaking circles where they're very focused on what's important to them or to their specific constituents. And oftentimes people are willing to have those broader discussions if you highlight that to them. But we've seen this in New Hampshire where we have, competing attention for contaminants where, yes, we have PFAS present in several water systems. We also have a whole bunch of arsenic all over the place. We are the arsenic, uranium, radon state, live free or die. And again, it's something where I think as you bring people together to talk about that, it's never fun and exciting because you're talking about, okay, where do we prioritize this? But I think people are willing to have those discussions, but we do run into that problem of certain things take more of the attention, and some folks can be a little combative initially because it can feel like you're being dismissive. So, right, if we say to communities, well, we have all these other issues, PFAS is just another thing on top of that. That gets back to a good risk communication piece of being mindful that, to some of these communities, they would point out and say, right, we know arsenic is natural in our state. We know this other thing is happening. A company that releases a compound, right, it gets back to that risk perception and some of those legal questions of this is something that, right, a company may have not known at the time that this was an issue, that it was a risk, that it was a liability. But in the same way, if you're going to ask sort of communities to sort of evolve their thinking, you also have to sort of ask the same in cases of like responsible parties, emitters, or even just the waste systems that we manage, is understanding, yes, they are conveyors. I try to be very careful not to call waste landfills or wastewater treatment plants sources. They are conveyors because us as consumers are sending them our things. So right, there is that thing, you're just trying to evolve that thinking and have those discussions. But as you pointed out, the climate change issue is pretty strong. I know that is a very heated area of debate around PFAS. Is right, if you're going to have bans on all PFAS, if you're going to push to legislate that, the electric vehicle, the sort of green energy movement is not interested in having that discussion at that point, especially when you're coming to the table immediately with, we want to ban this and you somehow need to come up with something safe, but we don't actually have an alternative for you. You just need to add that to your list of problems as a sector to deal with. And I think even getting back to waste management, environmental management, I think that's where, again, we all need to be conscious of our feelings when we're talking about things around the table or trying to talk about these big policy issues. Is if you just lay it at another sector's feet to say, by the way, you need to figure this out, not only the logistics of it, but also to pay for it, they're instinctually going to be resistant to that because they're dealing with their own problems.
Makes sense. No, it very much makes sense. A couple of very specific from your presentation, folks were asking, do you mention that PFAS is ultimately released, cleared from the human body? Folks wanted to understand that, and then the carcinogen nature of it. So, I don't know if you can help clarify.
Yeah.
So kind of what the mechanism for clearance and does it totally clear or kind of clear with time? And then how about the carcinogenic nature of it?
Okay. So with PFAS, basically, so let's say I go out and I go down to my local fast food chain and I get something in a fast food wrapper that is not PFAS free, because some companies are generally trying to transition away. So I want to give credit. There are folks that are looking for alternatives. But let's say that I have either my food's contaminated from the food packaging, from the food processing facility, because PFAS are used in a lot of food processing plants just for like the equipment, or maybe it was grown or raised in a contaminated area. Whatever the source is, I'm about to put something in my mouth that has PFAS in it. Because of their structure, especially the ones that have sort of the long chain and they have the fluorines all over there, right? If you swapped out all those fluorines for hydrogens, it basically looks like a fatty acid. So your body's pretty good at absorbing that. We have a limited number of studies that indicate for most animals, PFAS are very readily absorbed in the GI system. What's unique about PFAS is, right, if we talk about PCBs or certain pesticides, we always think of them as being lipophilic. It's a fat issue. If you give me whatever animal and tell me it's fat content, right, we can probably draw some line between fat content and predicted PCB or pesticide concentration, right? Who doesn't love a good paper on that? But with PFAS, they seem to be proteophilic because of their unique properties. They like protein. They also really like our blood plasma and like certain plasma proteins. So they compartmentalize into weird parts of the body. And sometimes that can even be bone because the fluorine calcium sort of interactions. As they circulate around in our blood and our serum, they can reach the kidney, and there seems to be something going on with kidney transporters. So, right, you have these things in your kidney that as you're forming urine, you want to put some stuff back in your urine, or you want to put some stuff in your urine and some stuff back into your blood, because you don't want to just filter blood out into your urine. That's called dying. So there's something about PFAS that it seems like we keep reabsorbing it when we shouldn't, especially for certain longer chain PFAS, whereas the shorter chain PFAS, right, so when they have smaller carbon backbone, they don't seem to do that, and we let go of them easier. So again, that complicates the picture of understanding which PFAS are toxic at which levels, because some of them go in, they go right back out. Other ones like PFOA and PFOS, they go in and they linger for a while. And some of that can even be species specific. So PFOA doesn't really accumulate in fish. PFOS, just by changing a carboxylic acid to a sulfonic acid, accumulates in fish like crazy. So,
there's a lot there.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and we generally are slowly, right? So your kidney is not 100% efficient at putting things back in the blood, so it's going to eventually release some of that out through the urine. Some of that can go out through the feces, but that's really the main typical way that we're all sort of sharing or shedding it. The other way that folks can be shedding it because of its structure and because it likes protein, anything that you're losing blood from, so menstruation in women is one way that PFAS can be lost. Another very large protein source that will remove PFAS from a woman's body is giving birth, because the placenta does not stop PFAS from crossing over. So most of us, if you're born after the 60s, you probably were born with PFAS. We have something in common, yay. But there's also this concern with PFAS is because of that structure, they look like fatty acids. The other thing that mammals are particularly good at eliminating PFAS from their body with is milk. And that's actually why a lot of states have set very low numbers. It's not so much for the protection of a guy like me walking around the street. It's for the protection of infants who are born to women that have been drinking the water for a long time, and those women are planning to breastfeed, because they'd essentially be transferring that over. And right now, the current guidance from the CDC and others is, you should talk with your physician if you're concerned about PFAS in breast milk, but at the same time, like a lot of the health effects we worry about with PFAS are countered by breastfeeding. We strongly still encourage women to breastfeed because it's incredibly good for mom, it's incredibly good for baby. But depending on your situation, if you're in a highly contaminated community, sure, have a conversation with your physician and go from there. So generally, PFAS can eventually slowly leave out through the body. The longer chains tend to stick around longer than the shorter chains do. That's why you see so much more focus, especially in remediation cleanup, on PFOA, PFOS, these longer chain compounds, because at very low levels, we're concerned about their accumulation over time.
Makes sense. No, it makes sense. It sounds like it's a really tough one, right? Because it's kind of like there's all these levers that you're pushing and pulling.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, no, it's
Yeah. So then with PFOA, PFOS, PFOA, I believe, was upgraded to a known carcinogen, which EPA doesn't do a lot of known carcinogens. So PFOS was upgraded, I believe, to suspected or probable carcinogen. So with those classifications, that's an EPA classification system. The International Cancer Group, I believe they've upgraded PFOA. I think it's either to their highest or second highest tier. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head right now. I will get back to you on that one. I will try to add a note. With those, the most significant associations or the most consistent associations that they've seen have been concerns with kidney cancer. There has been a lot of debate about the carcinogenicity because of how the epidemiology studies are being looked at, what the rodent studies can tell us. And I think a lot of that debate is sort of coming to this sort of point of how do we, as a professional group of toxicologists and risk assessors and epidemiologists, want to handle identifying these relationships? If you go back to the 1980s, the way we did this was you got X number of rats, you did X number of exposure studies, and we derived cancer factors from that we used to estimate risk. As we move forward, we're running into this challenge of we have thousands of PFAS and even more other chemicals on the market. That still freak me out. But we have a lot of these other chemicals that are coming out. We cannot run cancer assays on all of these. We have a limited number of studies. There are some relatively large epidemiology cohorts that have been run. Some of the largest epidemiology studies to date have actually been run for PFAS. So an example is the C8 panel out of West Virginia. And a lot of those are where we're seeing these associations to kidney cancer, some other forms of cancer, depending on the study and the population. And again, this is raising the question, as we go through and how do we determine these relationships? How do we evaluate this risk? There has been debate around that. And, from a public health practitioner perspective, it's really pressed folks in different agencies to figure out, well, do we wait until the data is perfect, or do we evaluate the risk on a limited number of studies that are not ideal? So
Correct, right. So I'm wondering, maybe just thinking about the audience, right? And so can you, in a couple of succinct ways or succinct phrase, help us understand the difference between when somebody's talking about toxicology versus epidemiology? Because those two studies, they are hand in hand.
yes.
And maybe not everybody online understands the subtlety between the two. So if you could maybe just explain, this is toxicology, this is epidemiology, so a way we'll get it. That would be helpful, I think.
Yeah. So I'll sort of describe this, but I want everyone to bear in mind, toxicology and epidemiology, they sort of exist in a Venn diagram over each other. So I'm going to try to describe their sort of most extreme versions, because I'm sure there's an epidemiologist on here that's just throwing their laptop across the room, like, why is this toxicologist talking? So with toxicology, we are really focused specifically on what is the chemical doing. We usually focus more into that realm of like organismal studies. We're really talking a lot about like physiology, molecular pathways. How is this chemical causing this effect? We're using methods to extrapolate effects we see in animals to human health or potential human health risks. We're also more directly using those to look at ecological risks, so wildlife and those impacts. Epidemiology is taking more of a population science approach, and it's looking more at whole groups of people. When you look at their exposure in a real world setting, what responses do you see to certain markers that you measure? Now, the problem with toxicology, so toxicology is great because we get all kinds of awesome molecular information. It can be very exacting and precise, but the problem is a rat's not a human. So we're trading off on realism by trying to really go at this more precise information, have a better understanding, and having more of that information to look across multiple species. Epidemiology, from my own perspective as a toxicologist, I'm speaking biased here, like the challenge there is there's a lot of confounding that raises questions. So, right, you can't account for everything else that people have been exposed to. But at the same time, it's an actual population that's had an exposure. So in cases where you have sort of like occupational groups, so people that are highly exposed to chemical because they're at a work site, or people that have been highly exposed because of the spill, it's easier to use those human epidemiology studies to show causation or draw really strong relationships to an exposure and a health effect. But with something like PFAS, where it could take years to decades to build up high levels of PFAS in the body, and you could take months, years, who knows, just depending on the health outcome, could take even longer to see that effect. It starts to raise a lot of questions. And in the ideal world, these two leverage each other's information to find consensus. I think one of the things that folks have been seeing around the discussion with PFAS and the MCLs and the regulatory implications and the epidemiology, the toxicology is we're sort of seeing this questioning of what's the process that we use to come to those conclusions and how do we act without enough information that's going to satisfy both groups to a certain degree. So I think that's sort of where there's this tension right now between these two sides of the Venn diagram. But I think that's also where, again, the ATSDR study that is tagged in my earlier slide, and hopefully the presentation in January will kind of get into this, is as much as there can be this tension and people saying, what about this information? What about that information? I think there's, with PFAS, especially PFOA, PFOS, we see enough of that overlap that we can all agree that there is a hazard. And right now, we're just trying to get within the exact right range of to what degree is it an issue, which again feeds into that risk assessment component and that sense of urgency for cleanup on certain sites.
So that makes sense. I think we can get our minds around like the hot spots, right? We're like, okay, this is a particular problem. There's some industrial site, or hey, we used it in a foam somewhere. I think a lot of us get our minds around that, right? And then we can even imagine, all right, there's some in our water, there's some passing by in our food. So maybe it'd be nice to control it at the source. And because I think there's a lot of folks that kind of look at this and, looking from some of the questions and comments like, well, if it's been everywhere for like these 30 years, like, wouldn't we all see ourselves sick from it if it was really that, that may be people leaning more towards that kind of that, well, where's the epidemiological justification for the limits as opposed to the toxicological, what can we measure? Where is this playing out in the legal liability side, right? Because I mean, America tends to be this not precautionary principle society. We're a little bit more on the litigious side. We'll use it and then sue somebody for it after the fact. So how is this playing out in the legal liability side? This gets into some of our audience thinking about their permits and what they're legally going to be required to deal with. So how is that part playing out?
Yeah. So let me start out with, let's think about producers, manufacturers, the upstream community, and then we'll talk about downstream. Oh my God, it's in the environment. What do we do now? So for the upstream side, there is more of this discussion of, broadly, us being the United States, there's a lot of those just sort of civil liability questions of who's going to come out and say, oh my gosh, your product has PFAS in it. And right, basically this gets treated like the next asbestos, or if you've ever been at the gym and just some lawyer commercial comes on,
right?
What now? And I think that's where, especially with the product bans that are going in different states, right now, a lot of the product bans are just at a stage where companies are needing to report if they have anything in there. Okay. A lot of the states don't actually have a very clear or very strong enforcement mechanism for when the bans go in effect. So you might pay a couple $1,000 fine, but depending on the size of your company, some companies might just roll their eyes and say, okay, we reported that we have PFAS in this product and we paid $4,000 in 2026.
Next.
Yeah. But I think there's also that liability. And again, that who's going to come out of the woodwork for whatever reason with a lot of these product bans having reporting going out, and that reporting going to state agencies, meaning that a fair amount of that is public information if it's requested. Right. right? You have companies that it's worthwhile to go through and maybe do an inventory of your products, whether or not you have to do that reporting or reach out to groups that are able to do that and help you out with that to understand, do you have a potential blind spot or do you have a potential vulnerability down the road if the regulations change or if your state begins pursuing that action? So there's that. There is a phase out of certain PFAS with the TSCA reporting that's going to be required for manufacturers and companies. They will probably start prioritizing other PFAS that they're going to ask companies to look into finding alternatives for. So again, you're just really at a point of, should you be preparing for the future? But again, too, are certain groups going to come out and try to have claims against you because you use PFAS in a product based on whatever their definition might be. For the sort of downstream side of things, I know the big thing that's getting a lot of attention is the CERCLA designation, because there will be administrative discretion, but you're looking at almost a fair number of Superfund sites, not even Department of Defense sites, are probably going to find PFAS at them. And it's going to be a question of, does that reopen your site? If you have a site that's not managed by EPA, but maybe it's managed by your local state regulator because, it was an old car wash or something else. Okay, are you going to have something get opened up under CERCLA designation because of that you'll be required to clean up for? I know for a lot of municipalities and sort of publicly owned waste management systems, the EPA has tried to be as clear as they can that they don't intend to go after those entities with the CERCLA power. But we're about to swing into a new administration. I'm not saying one way or another what they're going to do.
Yeah.
But there's still the piece of, there's whether or not the EPA goes after entities. There's also the question of, can community groups under their state laws or other reasons come after you because there is that CERCLA designation? So there's a federal one right now. Some states have their own hazardous waste definition that they're adjusting. When we start thinking about things like NIPD's permits, it's really going to depend on what the EPA does in the next coming months or next couple of years. I know they've been trying to collect data on that. Most wastewater plants are putting out in the low tens to hundreds of parts per trillion of PFAS if they are. We're still trying to nail down the EPA exact method that they will be using for monitoring. So it will probably depend on which state you're in. So for example, New Hampshire is not a delegated state. We don't get to set those permits. We get to help out and have a say in them, but our state doesn't do that. Now, if you're in Massachusetts or some of the other delegated states that actually can set their own permits, some of them may have already looked into this. If they have a drinking water standard, they may be applying some variation of that or some other number to NIPD's permits, or at least ask for monitoring for it. So there's that piece that will probably come in. And some states will probably be asking you to sort of go upstream in your sewer shed if you're looking at wastewater treatment plants to figure out, could you have source reduction and possibly looking at some industrial pre-treatment? Because guess what? Car wax, why do you think it works so well? It's PFAS. There's a lot of quirky sources that show up. And again, you can look things up using NAICS codes, business codes. You could try doing that kind of work. A lot of state regulators have looked into this. Or if you have academic partners in your state that want a fun project for students, just doing a basic assessment of what are your potential vulnerabilities to your waste infrastructure in your community from different businesses. It's not a bad place to start.
Well, and that's a great transition maybe into the part here at the end, right? Which is the advice we give to the emerging professionals, those that are hopping over into. I distinctly remember being at a public meeting decades ago where somebody stood up and said, I don't want pH 7, I want pH 0. Don't have any pH in that, in that stream. And you as a professional, you take that in and you appreciate their input. And so help our professionals that are moving from one sector to another sector, help them understand how they deal as a professional, based on your experience with with the consumers, with the public, there are so many folks that have so many views on this, and that risk communication is such an important part here. Do you have some advice? What should they get more training in so that they're good at it? What do they do to be able to work in this difficult space on this really important topic?
Yeah, so I would say not just for PFAS, but for a lot of issues, just getting some risk communication training. is really helpful, because being able to engage with the public, engage with your stakeholders, your company, whoever it is, and explain, I understand that we are in some situation here, whether or not it's a true 5-alarm fire or not. I understand there's an issue. I don't have all the answers right now, but I at least know where to start, and we can come up with a plan. That's an incredibly useful skill set. And also, it doesn't hurt for everyone to take a beat and say, okay, yes, there is going to be PFAS. Don't try to pass any judgments of whether or not it's a good or bad situation, but just remind yourself, we can figure this out. There are experts out there, and it's a very collaborative environment. People are typically going to want to help you out to the best that they can. For the sort of technical experts that are wanting to transition into the PFAS realm and get more information, look to regional work groups, look to an organization like this, AAES. Like, putting on a series like this is terrific, making it accessible to folks, giving you this opportunity, one, to get contact information, contact the speakers, use their email address. That's a really important thing to do, because everyone is trying to help each other out. There's a lot of information resources out there they can connect you with. Another great example of those work groups is, again, the ITRC PFAS team. It's made of academic partners, government partners, private sector partners. It's a very balanced source of information. They really try to lay out everything to help people with that initial onboarding into PFAS land, so you're not feeling like a novice in the room.
ITRC being?
The Interstate Technology and Regulatory Council.
Thank you.
Yep. So that'd be my biggest suggestion, is I would say start there with resources like that. But the ITRC team is great about putting you in contact with other state members, folks that, if you want to talk with your local state partners or regional partners that are working on this, reach out to folks. Like, we're all sort of being overwhelmed these days with PFAS and the changes. So everyone's always willing to have a discussion.
This was fantastic. What a fantastic way to start this series, John. I am so appreciative of you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Incredibly accessible, incredibly down to earth, very, very informative, incredible technical content, but really accessible. John, you totally knocked it out of the park with this. We'll turn it over to Marissa, but thank you, John.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, thanks everyone for all your questions, and thank you to John for sharing your knowledge with us today. We do have several webinars planned in the near future, including 3 more in this PFAS series. You can go to aaees.org/events to reserve your spot. Just a reminder, if you're not yet an AAES member and you're considering joining the Academy, please email me to discuss our membership options. Last but not least, PDH certificates for this event will be sent out shortly to board certified individuals. That's all for now. We enjoyed being with you all today. Thank you so much and have a great day.